Welcome to the Recovery Toolkit podcast. I'm Richie. I'm going to be your host. Throughout the series, we're going to talk to a range of different people who will give you tools and tips to help manage your recovery. The podcast itself is being brought to you by Epic Restart Foundation, who are a national charity who support people to rebuild a positive life after gambling harm. So today we've got a little bit of a different podcast, but one that I hope people find inspirational, educational, and go away thinking a little bit on the bigger scale around some of the topics that we're going to talk about. So I'm joined by Ali Barfield. I met Ali at a conference a couple of months ago, and Ali spoke, and I was blown away by his enthusiasm, the way that he approached the subject, and just thought the first thing that happened when he walked out of there was I jumped on him and said, please come on my podcast. So here we are, Ali. Ali, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is that you're known for, you do, or have you done, and why you might be here today?
Sure. So my name's Ali Barfield. Ali, please. I'm the director and founder of a non-profit called Deflect and Protect UK. And the idea of the organisation is to keep vulnerable people safe online. Originally, we were founded to look at the issues surrounding my community, the autistic community, and radicalization. But what I realized is that there were a number of things happening online that needed to be discussed, that needed to be brought forward, which is how I stumbled into the gambling space. My job is essentially to look at micro and macro trends online and then determine how they are affecting our kids in prison.
Yeah, and we're going to go in deep, I think, on this a little bit. When you said there, my community, the autistic community, what does that entail? Who might be in that community?
Sure. So I'm autistic ADHD. It's pretty common that when we're talking neurodiversity, and I'm sure we'll get into this later, people have more than one condition. So if we're talking about the neurodivergent community as a whole, it entails people who either believe they have or have been diagnosed with a form of neurodivergent condition. So this could be anything like autistic spectrum condition, what used to be called Asperger's syndrome, but is now just diagnosed as ASC or ASD. This can be ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, dyslexia, dysgraphia, a number of wide-ranging conditions all the way through to acquired neurodiversity, which I think is the thing that people don't mention too often. So acquired neurodiversity is things like brain damage or some form of brain injury or trauma. It can be caused by things like conditions such as MS, or more importantly, when we're talking about things like sort of addiction and things like that, it can be caused from addiction and substance abuse as well. So that's sort of the wider community as a whole. Yeah,
and that's a great sort of segue into why you're here. You know, this is the Recovery Toolkit podcast. We are Epic Restart Foundation, who is the charity that I work for, and we work in the gambling harm space. But we talk about all addictions really on the podcast. So what's the link, or why might there be a link? Tell us a little bit around what you know about it.
The way I always start with this is I explain that autistic people die younger. And the truth is that the stats are wildly all over the place, but the most commonly cited stats would suggest that autistic people die just over 6 years earlier than neurotypical people. It's a little bit less for ADHD people, but we still die younger. And one of the reasons for this is an increased predisposition towards addictive behaviors, as well as issues surrounding access to healthcare, particularly engaging with figures of authority.
Yeah, there's so much that we can dive into straight away, isn't there? So with gambling's obviously seen as a behavioural addiction. Why might that be such a risk to people?
Sure. So I think we need to go back and we'll go from the start and we'll look at things that are, and I'm always inclined to not resort to forms of stereotype when we're talking about conditions. I think it's really important that we talk about things that are commonly experienced by people who have certain conditions, but may not be universal.
Everyone.
Everyone. So if we think about ADHD as an example, the things that we would define as people who have ADHD can struggle with are things like a lack of focus, a lack of foresight or planning, particularly around finance, and an impulsivity. And we can see how all of those things may leave one to a predisposition towards gambling addiction in particular.
Yeah.
The autistic community also struggle with forms of addiction, but that stems from a different area. That stems often from a form of self-soothing mechanism. It can be very, very difficult to live in a world that's sort of not created for you. And often autistic people will experience forms of addiction as a form of coping mechanism. And gambling addiction can absolutely be one of those coping mechanisms that we go towards.
Yeah, to be honest, there's not many people, Ali, that I've worked with that after a few conversations, the addiction hasn't been a coping strategy, whether it be because of trauma, whether it be because unmet basic human needs, whether it be, for whatever reason, the addiction, gambling, drink, drugs, generally comes from trying to escape something, the feeling, the emotion, the dysregulation that people find themselves in.
It's interesting you use the word dysregulation because emotional regulation is something we often talk about struggling with for people with ADHD and autism in particular. So we can see how all these areas sort of coalesce together around sort of perfect targets and perfect sort of people to be, unfortunately, predisposed towards addictive behaviours.
Yeah, and I think it's important, something you said there was all of these things just increase the risk. And if you've got one thing that increases the risk piled on top of another thing and piled on top of another thing, the predisposition to addiction, and especially gambling, is just tenfold or more sometimes.
Yeah, and it's very rare you only have one condition.
Yeah.
And it's very rare. So we always talk about trauma and autism as an example, and we're not sure if experiencing trauma comes from innate vulnerabilities as part of the autistic lived experience. Autistic people are 3 times more likely, autistic women are 3 times more likely to be sexually assaulted. As an example, autistic people are 3 times more likely to be victims of mate crime. So we don't know if these vulnerabilities create the trauma that comes along, unfortunately, with sort of being an autistic person, or if, as I said earlier, living in a world that's fundamentally not made for you is a sort of inherently traumatic experience. But that trauma, looking for ways to self-soothe, looking to escape from it, we can see how that coincides with gambling addiction.
Yeah, and in my early addiction, Ali, I used to have to go in betting shops and put bets on, and that was how we gambled towards as my addiction progressed and the use of technology came about and mobile phones and internet and all that sort of stuff got better. It was much more accessible, so it's more accessible for everybody. But again, why might the increased risk affect these types these people that we're talking about at a greater risk, do you think? They spend more time online, don't they?
Yeah, to put it bluntly, yes.
Yeah.
Next question. No. So if we think about the way in which sort of primary forms of communication happen and communities develop, a lot of neurodivergent people's primary forms of socialization, of communication, becomes the internet. Now, if you think about it from an autistic perspective, let's use that as an example. I can go online and I can find somebody that's just as obsessed with Japanese role-playing games as I am. I can talk to them for hours on end. They are not going to judge me for lacking eye contact or not listening to them or not reading their body cues or whatever it might be. I can find these communities online, and that can be an amazing, empowering thing. And I'm always hesitant to talk about the harms of the internet without addressing sort of the
benefits,
the absolute benefits of the internet as a whole. But yes, as gambling has progressed to being more of a digital form, as we've moved away from the rat runs to the bet shop or the casino, we've moved towards digital spaces, we can see why they may appeal more to neurodivergent people, especially if I think myself about, we had a family holiday to Vegas when I was a child, and I hated the casino, and you have to walk through the casino lobby to go to the hotel, and I hated it because as an autistic person, I hate bright lights, loud sounds, flashing, people. We can see how, for many of us, the idea of a casino is a nightmare. But we can see how an online casino or an online space for gambling can become particularly dangerous.
Yeah, and I think that change that went through from probably 2005-6 time to where we find ourselves now is incredible. And I think there's obviously just been a white paper released, which is under consultation, but we've missed a trick with it, haven't we, Ali? Do you think?
Yes. Quite frankly, I think the white paper makes some amazing points, but I think that there are areas that it's missing, which we'll get into later, specific details. But I absolutely, definitely think that we need to take into account the way the internet impacts vulnerable communities, whether that's children or neurodivergent people, or anybody that's vulnerable. And I think we really need to look at the ways in which online gambling organizations are manipulating and using the algorithm to their benefit, because that's the big thing to know here.
Yeah, let's go there.
Cool.
Let's go there, Ali. Tell us about it.
Sure. So we talk about the algorithm as though it's a living being, or it's a robot that has some form of moral compass or cares. It doesn't. Fundamentally, if I'm on my Instagram page, it knows that I will watch a video of a baby hippo. So it'll show me another video of a baby hippo, and another one, and another one, and another one, until my entire feed is baby hippos. Or in my case, Warhammer painting, because that's an autistic interest of mine. So when we are finding people who are trying to escape from their addictions or struggling with their addictions, it will show you endless content that you consume. I have made TikTok accounts, typed in gambling, watched one gambling video, and within 2 minutes, the entire feed is just gambling videos. And the way in which gambling is shown and discussed isn't in a responsible manner. A lot of the time, it's shown as a get-rich-quick scheme, or it's shown as something that is only beneficial, only a positive entity, a fun activity to do.
Glamorized as well, isn't it?
That's exactly the word, yeah. It's a glamorized depiction of something that we know is far more complex than that, far more complicated. So when we're really talking about the way in which the internet affects young people in particular, I think we need to talk about influencers. So what happened around 2021, about a year after the pandemic finished, or as we were getting out of the pandemic, is a number of online gambling organizations, particularly those that aren't centralized to Britain, created incredibly lucrative contracts to influencers. They particularly targeted live streamers who had shown addicted behaviors towards video games. So live streamers that would play World of Warcraft for 15 hours a day. Live streamers that would play FIFA for 20 hours a day without stopping. And they gave them incredibly lucrative contracts to online gamble. And when we're talking about this content, I think it's really important that we talk about just how boring it is. A lot of the time, it's somebody in front of a slot machine, a digital slot machine, barely talking, gambling millions and millions and millions of pounds. And we're really talking about millions of pounds here. XQC has gambled over $1.5 billion worth of bets online.
Who's XQC?
XQC was the world's largest streamer for a long period of time. He's particularly known for being neurodivergent himself. He has a very strong following that are very passionate about him. His average watch time is somewhere around 6 to 8 hours. So we got to think that the content that they're consuming, his fans are consuming, is for very, very long periods of time. It's not EastEnders on for half an hour 3 times a week. It is an endless cavalcade of a message. And that message has been, since 2021, online slot machines, primarily.
XQC is a streamer. I bet loads of people listening to this have got no idea who he is. Who would know who he is?
Young people, neurodivergent people who are chronically online, people who seek the comfort of other people online, who build their communities online. He is a man who is one of the most influential human beings that's ever lived. But because you don't walk into an Asda and buy an XQC t-shirt, it's hard for us as adults to sort of gain a glimpse into that world and just how influential it's become.
Yeah, and I think that's the missing link, I think, isn't it, currently in the world, or in this country especially, is my kids, 9 and 11, are growing up in a different world to what I grew up in 30 years ago, and you think, oh, well, they're 30 years, of course they are, but it's so different. It's not even, I struggle to comprehend some of the things that they do, they say, they talk about, they watch, and it's scary, and tell us your views on that.
It's difficult, and it's difficult as adults to sort of gain a glimpse into a world that isn't tangible. I know if my kid's playing football because I go down to the football pitch and he's covered in mud, and my wife yells at me because he's covered in mud. I know that dynamic, but when we don't have a tangible entity, when it's an existential concept, when we're talking about Gen Alpha, I always describe them as digitally incubated.
So who is Gen Alpha?
Gen Alpha were born between 2010 and 2025, so they're still being born right now. Gen Alpha represents a completely different demographic to the way in which other people have interacted with technology. So I'm a zillennial. I'm somewhere between millennials and Gen Z. I was born in the early 90s. And we had the internet when I was 6 years old, but it was still wired and it was still dial-up and it was still in its infancy. And then generations that are older than mine, Gen Xers, millennials, etc., they are digital nomads. They've come to technology much later. So we've got digital natives, Gen Zs, zillennials, and then we've got digital nomads. But Generation Alpha are digitally incubated. When we get a child now, we give the child an iPad. Its primary form of reading, language acquisition, communication, its eye point into the world, the way it views the world, everything is through a screen. It's through a digital lens, because the internet is now a ubiquitous entity for better or worse. I was listening to David Bowie in the late 90s talking about the internet, and he said, the internet will be the greatest invention ever created because it will fundamentally change our souls. I think it's a really interesting idea, particularly for Generation Alpha and the way they interact online.
I think there's a few big things you've said in there. It'll change our souls. David Bowie said that. It's changing everything, isn't it? Like, it's changing us from top to bottom, from inside out, back to front. Like, there's honestly everything I look at now, there's a quicker, faster, easier way than there was 10 years ago. And kids are coming into that world now. My kids show me the quicker, faster way to do everything, just about. And that, as a parent, first and foremost, is uncomfortable sometimes. And then there's also the question of, how do I keep them safe? And sometimes the easy thing to do is to go, didn't say that, because I don't know how to keep them safe. And that becomes a bit of a challenge as well, So advice?
Well,
talk us through what potentially we could do.
I always use the sort of the spray paint example. I don't know if I've ever explained this to you before, Richie. The spray paint example is this idea of teenage rebellion. When we as adults see a teenager spray painting a wall, we view it as an act of vandalism. It's crime, it's deviant in nature. It's not. They are leaving a mark on the world. They are showing that their actions have consequence, and they are changing a world that's always controlling them. It's very difficult for children and young people because we tell them when to wake up, when to go to sleep, what to eat, when not to eat, sit here, stand up, don't do that, don't do this. So it's very, very difficult because we don't want to control them any more than the world already controls people to keep them safe. I mean, they're children. And at the same time, one doesn't want to wish to ostracize a child. Yeah. You want them to build those social connections with other young people. I think fundamentally, the greatest thing that we can do as adults is create a safe space for young people to come to us and say, I saw something online, it made me uncomfortable, please don't be angry. Or, can you explain what this is, Dad? And I think as adults, we often think that we need to know the answers. Kids like nothing more than to be told, I don't know, let's figure it out together. Let's explore that idea together. Let's see how that impacts us. From a parental control standpoint, there are lots and lots of forms of parental controls for apps and technology and video games and consoles, But fundamentally, young people will always find a way around them.
Yeah.
It's
just like a gambler. If they want to go and gamble, they'll gamble, won't they? And I talk about this with people in recovery all the time. When we talk about self-exclusion or, putting blockers in place, it's okay having them, but if you want to gamble, you'll go and gamble.
Oh, yeah.
Kids, if they want to find a way, they'll find a way. They're very resourceful. They're very creative. Sometimes their minds are far greater at creating a solution to the problem than some of the adults that I know.
Absolutely.
So there's lots of ways people can find ways around stuff. When you said there, Ali, it's important that you create a safe space. That's something we talk about all the time in recovery. Safe space, empathy, understanding. What would a safe space for a kid that's experiencing some of this stuff online look like? What would a parent potentially have to do to create a safe space?
I think when we're talking about kids, we should meet them where they are. As adults, we have a tendency to walk into their rooms and say, "What's going on? Talk to me in person." I always advocate for WhatsApp chats. Take a screenshot of something if it makes you uncomfortable and send it to me. Tell me how that makes you feel. Where did you find this? I won't be mad. I'm not going to take your iPad away. I just want to know how you're engaging with the outside world. Because kids are putty. They can be molded and morphed in any way. So a safe space, to me, looks like either a digital or an analog space, in person, around the dinner table. How's your day? How are you viewing the internet? What content are you looking at? Take an interest in the things your kids are interested in. If your kids think that Logan Paul is the coolest man that ever lived, ask them why. Because if there's one thing people like to talk about, it's the things they're passionate about, fundamentally.
Yeah, and I love that, isn't it? Because the first reaction is, what are you following him for? What are you watching him for? And then there's resistance, and then there's confrontation, and that's just the quickest way to distrust and dishonesty and people not opening up and not having a safe space, isn't it? So sometimes we've got to stop first and foremost, think about what it is we're trying to achieve, and then try and, like you say, meet kids where they're at. We talk about in recovery, you've got to go meet the person you're trying to support where they're at. There's no point saying, "Oh, well, come and do what I do," even though I'm 10 years in recovery compared to somebody that's just coming through the door day one. Go and follow somebody or spend time around somebody that's 3 months in recovery and learn what they've been doing for their early days. And I think it's the same with kids, isn't it? That's something that we really need to put into practice and try to do the best of our ability.
And a lot of the way this ties into sort of gambling and online gambling is this concept called aspiration culture. I don't know how familiar you are with it.
Just from what you've taught us, Ali, but I'm sure people that listen and haven't heard it before.
A lot of the messaging that we send to young people now online is that money is good, and that sort of the best thing a person can do is to have flash cars and expensive clothes, designer clothes, and go on holiday trips all around the world. And it's because primarily that's the content that sells best to children. We discovered this about 10, 12 years ago on YouTube. YouTubers who showed off lavish lifestyle. They would rent mansions in Hollywood. At one point, there was an entire street of Hollywood that was just mansions rented to YouTubers. Even now, in LA, influencers can rent a private jet cabin to make fake videos showing themselves in a private jet online. It's become a bit of a joke online as an adult, but you can see why for young people that's really appealing.
Attractive, yeah.
I always use the Lamborghini example. When I was a child, the only child in my class that knew what a Lamborghini was the kid that was into cars.
Yeah.
I went and did a conference in London a few months ago, and I had a coffee outside of St Pancras Station. I was waiting for a train, and there's a hotel there, very, very luxurious hotel, and there was a Lamborghini parked outside. 14 children took selfies there in the 10 minutes I was there. It was more than one a minute. We have to understand how these messages are impacting young people, how this sort of lavish lifestyle differs to that presented by a pop star or a footballer, because content now is endless. If Michael Jackson makes an album, Michael Jackson puts his album out, he puts some music videos out, he goes on a tour, 3 years pass, Michael Jackson reappears. But it doesn't work like that anymore. The content is every single day, it's an endless drip feed, it can be 7 or 8 hours at a time watched by young people. It doesn't stop. So the messaging that, aspirational culture, working hard, getting rich, is an endless message a lot of the time to young people. And gambling is portrayed in a glamorized way of acquiring that money. That's fundamentally how it's shown online, because the gambling responsibly that we would see on advertising doesn't apply to influencer deals.
So influencer deals, how do they get around that then?
Well, fundamentally, they're not based in the UK. We have, there's a good example of this where a online casino flew a 17-year-old to Mexico because you can gamble legally there under the age of 18 so that he could gamble. They put him up in a villa. Influencer deals are never in the UK. And I think a lot of the time as adults we assume that the content young people are interacting with is British. Because when I was a child, I watched Bodger and Badger on CBBC or whatever, Mr. Blobby or whatever it might be. But the truth is now that content is international. The idea that a child is going home and putting on a live television program, that they have to be there for 9 p.m., farcical. It's just not the way they are. So a lot of the time the content is in other countries where regulation isn't available. It's on websites that are owned by a lot of the gambling entities themselves and used to funnel young people, often young people, online. And a lot of this can be circumvented with a VPN. Are you familiar with a VPN?
Yeah, my kids talk about them all the time.
Sure. So a VPN is a virtual private network. And you can use it online for a very low cost or free to appear like you are anywhere else in the world. So I can set my location to Mauritius really easily. It's one of the top ones. And then I can go gamble online on online casinos that are based out of small countries you've never heard of that don't require you to show an ID or a license. Now, the question is, why do young people talk about it all the time? And it's because about half of all YouTube videos are sponsored by VPNs now. That's how almost all of their advertising is structured.
Yeah, and I think YouTube, we're probably all aware of YouTube, but YouTube's a different beast now, isn't it? You know, my kids' YouTube shorts are the thing that they just sit and scroll through constantly all the time, and you just never know what's coming up on them. That's part of the issue I have anyway as a parent, but that's where they get their education from. That's where they get an understanding of what a VPN is. That's where they get the understanding of all the streamers and YouTubers and influencers and all of that sort of stuff. But then coming off even YouTube, there's like a bigger issue, would you call it, on other sort of streaming platforms and stuff?
Yeah, there are. There are issues on other streaming platforms around gambling content, gambling being glamorized, more specifically streaming platforms being owned by gambling entities. And being used to funnel. So when a influencer gambles, often for 10, 11 hours at a time, in the corner of the screen will be a QR code or an advertisement that you click. You get free £20, $20, it's always in dollars, US dollars, free $20 to sign up with my code and that sort of thing. So not only do they have incredibly lucrative deals, $10 million a year just to do it, as well as free bids online to gamble, free money to gamble with, and affiliate marketing as well. So you've got all three working at the same time. And I think a really important thing to note is about YouTube Shorts or TikTok or Instagram Reels is that a lot of the time the content's reposted. So a lot of the time you'll be watching a clip on YouTube Shorts and it'll be from a completely unrelated account that's stolen the video and re-uploaded it for advertising revenue. So when you read an article that says X influencer has been deplatformed, we know now it doesn't really work because their fans will always spread a message, especially if there's money involved.
Yeah, it scares me. It scares me. And it's just from a safety point of view, isn't it? Like, I know what I was like as a child, and I wasn't exposed to anywhere near this level of content, of influencers, of online gaming, of online gambling. We spoke earlier about people's kids, neurodiverse community spending more time online, gaming and stuff. What's the link between gaming and gambling?
Yeah, so we need to go back to, I don't want to do too much of a history lesson, but we need to go back to the 80s in Japan. There was a concept called gachapon. where you capsule machine toys. I don't know if you've seen these.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
put a 100 yen coin in, you twist it, and you get a chance to win a rare one. We understand now this is a gambling mechanic. Now, what happened is this moved on to Pokemon cards when I was a child. You buy Pokemon cards for £2. There's a 1 in 1,000 chance you win a Pokemon card that's worth £150, £200. So there was a form of basic gambling in there. And this moved on to loot boxes, which was a digital form of the same thing. Now, what happened is gambling entities, particularly those we've spoken about at length, realized that gamification of gambling could happen. So why would one have to do a traditional slot machine when you could do a game that looks like Minesweeper and win real money with it? Because it doesn't matter the quality of the game, the dopamine release comes from the almost winning.
Anticipation.
The anticipation. Exactly. So what's happened is we've seen an increase of gamification of gambling. Now, what's really sinister is we're seeing this on platforms aimed specifically at young people. AI-generated videos claiming to be influencers that are popular with children saying, go and try out this gamified gambling system. That's what we're seeing happening.
Yeah, I think I seen one yesterday. I think it was Mr. Beast said, and this might be his game actually. I don't know if this is AI or if this is actually him. This, and that's scary in itself. That you don't know, you can't tell the difference. But it was like, come and play this game, and I'll give you 1,500 quid. What I was giving you was free spins for 1,500 quid. But it's my kids that are seeing that, and it's like, oh, can we play this game? And I'm like, no, you can't. But my kids know not to press the button. I hope. That's my hope. But many kids do, don't they?
Yeah, of course. Of course. I mean, Mr. Beast is the best example of AI-generated adverts because he is the most popular YouTuber that's ever lived. He's the most subscribed YouTuber that's ever lived. If you were to watch his videos in the amount of time they've been watched for, they're older than the Earth is. That's how popular he is. That's how much content is consumed here. So we need to talk about the length of time people are watching this content. And yes, fake apps espousing to be Mr. Beast that are gambling, either slot machines or casinos online, are specifically targeted towards children. That's what's happening. And then influencers that are teenagers, that are aimed at teenagers, are doing a very similar thing. I always use the example of Drake. Are you familiar with Drake? Aubrey Graham? He's a rapper and a singer from Canada. He made a really good album in 2012 and then kind of dropped off, in my opinion. But regardless, Drake is sponsored by a number of gambling entities. And he will live stream. And the amount in which he live streams are roulette wheels for $100,000 a spin. They are online slot machines for $1 million a click. It's money that is life-changing, unfathomably large amounts of money. And the messaging to young people is, this is normal. This is a regular expectation because it's glamorized.
It's just unbelievable numbers, isn't it? Like, I mean, my kids are fascinated now. Like I said, 9/11, they're fascinated with how much money mum and dad earns. And like, when you're telling them, they're like, what do you go to work for that for? And they just don't grasp that that's the reality of the world we live in, because they're so attached to this glamorized and influencer world where people are talking in hundreds of thousands and millions and billions. And it's just, yeah.
It's monopoly money.
Yeah, it's so far removed from reality, isn't it?
It is. And I think that's why we need financial literacy. So in the dream world, we would be going into schools and parent groups, explaining what's been happening, but more importantly, we'd be delivering financial literacy interventions and classrooms. We would explain how much things cost, where money is, how tax works, and then how to avoid things like lifestyle inflation, like glamorization of gambling, to understand that the house wins, And I think that's a really important way of reaching out to those communities.
How do we do that?
We spread the word. Fundamentally, the only way we get any message heard is by talking about it, is by liking and sharing the video, is by going out and saying, please, can we do something about this?
Yeah.
It is to educating and understanding, because young people lack that ability to discern nefarious content, that ability to view what's real, what's AI, what's imaginary, the lines become so blurred. We know if we watch a film starring Eddie Murphy, he's playing a character. But modern day Eddie Murphy, a streamer like Kaisenet, the world's biggest streamer as an example, when you explain to young people that that's a character he's portraying, when he's on his own, he's not jumping up and down and screaming and throwing KFC at the camera, they don't believe you because they say, but I've watched him sleep. His third most viewed category is sleeping. Young people are watching streamers sleep on stream. Amaranth famously said, she's a famous streamer, that she earns more money sleeping than she does awake on stream. So there needs to be a discussion about the way in which those relationships form, the way in which young people become attached to creators, because the power that they hold is unfathomable. It's impossible to define.
Yeah. What do we call that?
Parasocial relationships.
Parasocial relationships. I should know that. I've heard you say it 3 or 4 times already today.
We call it a parasocial relationship because it's that one-way form of attachment. And what we know about parasocial relationships is that the word-of-mouth advertising from an influencer that has a large following of people who have parasocial relationships with them, we know that word-of-mouth advertisement is as strong as a friend or a family member.
Yeah.
And that's why Kylie Jenner gets paid $2 million an Instagram post, because that form of advertising is the future. Because it's unskippable, it can't be ad blocked, it's not on live television, it's where young people are. And that's the future of advertising.
Yeah, I think my kids are obsessed with Starbucks at the minute for the same reason, because that's all they ever see.
Yeah.
You know, influencers drinking Starbucks. You know, and it's scary because it's a brand in itself. They've done a really good marketing campaign around it. They're putting the money where they need to put the money. But the next generation, I'm not watching loads of people drink coffee and think I want to go to Starbucks, but my kids are.
Yeah.
You know, and that's just coffee. So when you start talking about, like you've just spoke about, all the gambling and streaming and all of that sort of stuff, it's a real risk, isn't it, that we just need to be aware of.
It's absolutely a risk. My job didn't traditionally involve gambling. I'm not from the gambling world. And the fact that I'm aware of it, the fact that I look at trends, macro and micro, and view how they affect young people online and how pervasive this has become, because it's not slowing down. It is absolutely not slowing down. And as AI continues to evolve, it's only going to get worse.
So with AI, I think AI is a scary 2 letters for a lot of people, my age or older probably, who just haven't been around it and are very fearful of it. But we need to get used to it, don't we? It's not going anywhere.
The new Microsoft laptops have an AI button built into them.
Yeah, I've just seen the new iPhone has also got AI built in. It was just, well, what's that going to do? But actually, when you see it, the capability of it is just unimaginable.
It's going to change the world. It already is beginning to. In the space of a year, we've gone from AI-generated images all having 6 fingers to things that are very difficult to determine. And we've already seen AI-generated pornography of famous women online being used and abused, which is obviously disgusting. We've seen fake AI advertisements of child content creators espousing gambling. What happens when the content becomes impossible to pass? But more than that, what happens when we become difficult to regulate?
Yeah.
If it's constantly evolving and constantly creating and constantly procreating itself online, how do we regulate that? And that's why I think financial literacy, that's why I think literacy, going to children and explaining to children the harms, is the most important thing. Because otherwise we are playing catch up with billion-dollar entities and AI algorithms.
Yeah, definitely. So what's the solution, Ali? We spoke about it. Like, people listening to this podcast might have kids, you know, they might, wherever, they might have partners with kids, kids might be in their lives. What do they have to do, or what can we do as a community? I know we've said speak about it, reduce the stigma, all of that sort of stuff, but what's some practical things for somebody that's listening to this podcast that they might want to go and do?
Super practical things. All video games consoles have parental controls. Enable parental controls. Super easy to do. You can find a million guides on YouTube how to do it. pay attention to what your kids are watching. And I don't mean be a helicopter parent and tell them don't watch this, don't watch that, but keep an ear out, have a listen, consider the way that impacts them, and then consider possibly making alternate points. So if you hear somebody talking about the power of a Lamborghini and how good they are, you can say, a Lamborghini's not going to get 150,000 miles driving to school and back. It's not going to get you all home. It's safe, is it? It doesn't have a roll cage, you know. It's about pushing against the messages they'll be hearing. And it's about, most importantly, not chastising young people or telling them they're wrong or telling them off. Because at the end of the day, they're vulnerable children. They are sponges, and they'll take up any message and run with it. So it's about having those conversations with young people in your life, enabling parental controls, talking to them, talking to other parents about concerns that you have, talking to teachers. You know, teachers are always playing catch up just like we are, you know. So I think they're the most practical things that we can do fundamentally. And just being an open book where kids can come to you and ask you if you're concerned, and creating that space. That's the most important thing, is to say, Mr. B says gambling's a good thing, and you can say, well, let's have a conversation about gambling.
Yeah.
I think that's the most important thing.
So that's with kids, you know. As a charity ourselves who support people in recovery from gambling, I know a lot of people that listen to the podcast work in this space. I know people work in the drugs and alcohol space. What's some of the things we need to be aware of when we're working with neurodiverse community?
So the first thing I always talk about, always, is to be aware that a lot of the time, not always, but a lot of the time, people in the neurodivergent community have negative experiences with figures of authority. We talked about lack of access to healthcare earlier. So let's consider suspension rates for children. 56% of all suspensions in the UK are for autistic children. It's really high considering 1 in 100 children are autistic. That's incredibly high. So we have to consider how those negative experiences can impact, especially because a lot of parents may be neurodivergent and not diagnosed. They may have had negative experiences with social workers, with police officers, whatever it might be in their life. So I think it's always important that when we're approaching the neurodivergent community or working with the neurodivergent community, we talk to them not from a point of authority.
Yeah.
Meet them at their level. Go for a coffee with them. You know, turn up in a cap and shorts. Don't, whatever you do, turn up in a suit in an office, because we will explode. Reduce those sensory inputs. Consider turning the lights off, opening the door, going for a walk. People with ADHD like myself, we love a walk and talk meeting. There's nothing better. It gets your mind going. And we know that helps for mindfulness and well-being anyway, that exercise. So they're the things that I would always look at to start with.
Yeah.
And then my advice is always go out, consume content, read books, go on YouTube, figure out methods and strategies for communication that you think would help your neurodivergent client. And the single most important thing, just ask us. Just fundamentally just say, how can I talk to you better? How can I meet you on your level? What would you like me to do?
Yeah, I think that's something we talk about a lot with our clients, especially is we talk about like lapse or relapse plans, action plans. Like if that's going to happen, potentially it might. We hope it doesn't, but potentially it might. Who are you then going to go and speak to? And when you go and speak to them, what do you want them to do? Because they want to fix you, naturally, because it's our human nature to do that. But actually, that's not probably what you want. You probably want to be heard, and you want them to listen, and you want them to support. But if they don't know how to do that, what chance have they got? Do you know what I mean? They're probably not going to do the right thing. So have the conversation first and understand that. And then I think the flip that on its head is about asking people, isn't it? How do you want support? How can I support you? What do you need from me? They're really good questions to put to people and see what comes back. And I think like that, it's so important that people are okay at doing that, because we can sometimes go on the defensive. We can sometimes go on there, well, I don't really know, so I don't want to look stupid. I don't want to upset someone, you know. Even having this conversation with you today, Ali, I was like, oh, I've got to watch what I say and how I say it. And I don't. I just need to be me, and I just need to say, no, I don't have an understanding of that, Ali. Can you explain it? I have an understanding, because that's the two-way education, isn't it? It's like we learn from your community, hopefully you learn something from us. That's the way it works. It's two-way. It's got to be communication. It's got to be understanding that we're all different and meeting each other where we're at.
Absolutely. And just like meeting young people, it's non-judgmental.
Yeah.
Just because one form of communication is different doesn't make it worse.
Yeah.
If we have a meeting where I'm staring in the corner of the room and you're staring on the floor, that might be the best meeting of my entire life.
Yeah.
You know, especially when we're looking at double empathy theory. I don't know how familiar you are with double empathy theory as a concept, but it's this idea that particularly autistic people, our forms of communication aren't worse. We have great communication with each other. You know, the first time I heard about double empathy theory was from a student of mine, and she was staring at the roof and I was staring at my shoes at the time. And I remember thinking, oh, wait, no, maybe there is some logic to this. So it's about empowering those members of staff you may have that are neurodivergent, you know, empowering, tapping into your own community, working with them to help fix a problem. I think that's the way it is.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. Ask the people you want to help. Where's a better place to get the answers?
Yeah.
You know, and I think we are a very passionate organisation with lived experience at the heart of everything we do. You know, but majority of our team are lived experience, have suffered gambling harm, so we've been there, we've experienced it. But that doesn't mean me, somebody who's in recovery, all understands, because I've got lived experience, that I understand every other person that's in recovery. So actually, they show up different. They have different needs. They have different wants. They have different desires. Just because you've got lived experience doesn't mean you can relate to everybody. No. And I think that's an important message, that we've still got to ask the question. Just because you've got lived experience, just because you're neurodiverse, just because you're autistic, doesn't mean that you understand every other autistic person. And not every other autistic person wants to communicate in the same way as you do. And that's really important, isn't it? That assumption is just the killer of everything, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And if you think about the things that I've suggested as ways of examples, they benefit lots of people, irrespective of whether they're neurodivergent or not. A lot of people would prefer to go for a walk and have a chat. I know my dad would, and he's the most neurotypical person you'll ever meet in your life. So I think being flexible and being open to differing forms of communication is a really positive way of meeting everyone on their level.
Yeah, love it. I love it. What would be your closing message, Ali? What would be the one big thing you would really want people to take away from listening to this podcast?
Sure. It would be that just because something is existential, just because it's not a concrete thing that we can touch and feel, doesn't mean that it doesn't represent a level of harm. But it also doesn't mean that it's an entirely negative thing. The internet represents a brand new world for all of us. I think when we got to 2002, we thought, oh, this will be the internet from now on. Amazon.com, BBC. But what's happening is so rapidly changing, and it's so important, and that young people deserve a right to communicate online, just like neurodivergent people. But it's about meeting communities where they are, asking them how they feel, and fundamentally understanding and listening to them. That's the message.
Yeah, I love it. Do you know what it is, Ali? I was been so looking forward to this conversation, just because every time I listen to you, I have loads of questions, and today I got the opportunity to ask some of them questions. Do I feel more equipped and better as a parent to help my children? Probably not. Like, that's an internal thing that's going on potentially, but I'm more aware, and that's the gift that you've give us as me and the podcast and the listeners. And honestly, it's just great listening to you. I'm excited to see what comes next from you, Alex. I know you're involved in a lot of projects, and I know you're speaking at a lot of places. If people want to reach out and potentially get you involved in some of the stuff they're working with, how might they do that?
Sure. So I'm on LinkedIn, Ali Barfield. We'll put it in the description, I'm sure. My organisation is called Deflect and Protect. Our website is going live at the end of the month, and that's www.deflectandprotect.co.uk. Get in touch with me. Even if you just have a question, I'm always happy to answer, and I am permanently online, so I'm always free.
Ali, it's been a pleasure, mate.
Thank
you for meeting the journey.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Recovery Toolkit podcast. If you took something positive from it, then why not subscribe? If you or somebody you know has been suffering gambling-related harm, why not head over to our website where you can join our community? The link is in the show notes.